Okay, well, I decided that I have made her eye a little bit too tall. If you compare this eye with this eye, you can see this one looks much larger. And yesterday I actually reduced the width, but today I see that it's still too tall. And basically what I think happened was I painted the iris the entire height, including the height of where the eyeliner was supposed to be. Now, because that was blackish, you know, super dark paint for the eyeliner, I need to really just remove all of that and go into the eye a little bit. And then when that's dry, I will, actually while it's wet, I'm going to add a little bit of color back up here. And when that is dry, I will come back and add the eyeliner. Maybe I'll make the iris just a smidgen larger than it is right now. Just the tiniest bit. It doesn't need to go up any more than that. While I am in the eye, I'm going to try to introduce a few little bit lighter, there we go. Now we get a little bit, some of that variation in the eye that I was trying to put in earlier had gotten lost. Probably too many liftings working around the eye to, they kind of just filled in. And so all I did was I dabbed water in a couple little spots and then dried it with the paper towel. That lifted the paint from those couple areas and added that little bit of texture to the eye that's really important. And okay, now I just, see, I did what I thought I shouldn't do, and I put that color in, that additional brown color a little bit too soon. So now I'm basically just repeating what I just did. Putting the shadow up there. I want a little tiny bit of highlight right over the eye, and then when all of that is dry, I'll come in and add the eyeliner and mascara. I'm still, you know, I on this side did indicate a couple of little tiny eyelashes in one spot, just so people wouldn't think she didn't have eyelashes. Didn't think she didn't have eyelashes, excuse me. But even doing that can be on the dangerous side. Now over here on the side, which I brought in yesterday, I had a couple little eyelashes there, and that's plenty. That is the most you want to put in. All right, so I'll come back and finish reshaping her eye when that area is dry. You can see that I went ahead and I did a lot of her clothing. I started the mug. The mug is not quite done. It's still got a few little wooden pieces I haven't done that are some of the darker color wood. But today I was going to focus on her skin. Now I started her skin on this arm, which is her left arm, but I was a little tentative in my color, and it's a little bit too washed out, so I just want to bring a little bit more. First I'll bring a little raw sienna up into there, give it a little bit more vibrance, and then bring a little bit of the Quin Coral up on top of that. Just let those colors blend on the paper, which is how I do prefer to paint. And I'm going to remove a little paint from my brush so that it's a little less coming up in this direction. So we get that curvature of her arm. The photo goes down a little bit further than the painting does, so it cuts off really part way, you know, even before you get all the way through that set of buttons there. So we're only seeing a very small amount of her arm. And the pink is running a little bit farther south than I want, so just lifted a tiny bit of that. Okay, so let's get back to her hand. Now, I have painted the upper handle of the mug, although I need, I guess we'll go and finish that little piece. There was a little bit darker center line that I didn't put in yesterday because the paint was still too wet. And now that I have that in there, I want to actually lighten the back piece. It seems like it goes from light to a little dark line in the center where it's too, I think just like the rest of this, the handle also has slices of wood running through it, so there's a couple of different colors of wood involved. And that happens to be one of the lighter ones there, and which also means I need to get her top. The color that's on her top ran into that a little bit. Actually, that could be, there is a little of that along the edge of the handle, so let me just go for that instead of trying to remove it, because it appears to be fairly staining between the permanent alizarin and the purple that I'm using to make that kind of burgundy color. One or the other of those is fairly staining, so. All right. And then I went ahead and I did do her thumb after I did the handle. So the thumb is the only thing on the hand that you missed. So I did want, because hands, people get really hung up over doing hands, and you know, if you don't think about them as hands and just think of them as shapes, and make sure that you're getting some good shapes, getting the shapes that you're seeing. So the first thing that I need are some very pale colors, and I would like it to be a little bit of a blend of the Rossiana and the quinacridone coral, and there's two reasons for that. The quinacridone coral is on the staining side, whereas the Winsor Newton Rossiana is not. It's a granulating color, and I've mentioned before, granulating colors do tend to lift more easily. So I like to blend them so that I have a little bit of you know, it improves my ability to lift the colors should I need to. Now that's a pretty good color for the second value. But the very top edge of the finger is really light. I mean, it's barely a 1 on the scale of 1 to 10. So all I did was I wet my brush and I put a little water there, and I'm letting that slightly darker color bleed down. And you know, it'll bleed down a little more than I want it to do, and I'll have to continue to come back and dry my brush, come back and wipe that a little more, because I'm looking just for the palest tint. And that's going to be true on all of the fingers. Now, I do need a little bit slightly darker color coming over to the shaded side of her finger. And I'm going to go ahead and work one finger fairly pretty much up to completion before I move on to the other ones. And I may do the others a little bit differently, of not bringing each finger to completion before I move on to the next one. But I just want you to kind of see the whole process on one finger first. All right, now there's a little bit of a rosier color right here towards the end of that finger, and I think it's because it's beginning to bend down. So you got to always remember, where is your sun? The sun's coming from above in this particular image, and so this upper part of the finger. So if we look, it's going to be in the opposite hand. But if I hold my hand like this, and the light is going to be hitting up here on the top, and that's where we're seeing the lightest color. And then there's a little less light hitting here, so it's a little bit darker. And then as it comes down here, close to the next one, it's now on the underside, and so it gets a little darker. And actually, as it comes towards the front of the mug, it gets very dark, because now it's getting no light. The light is being blocked by the handle itself. I'm not going to put that darkest color in just yet, because I need the paint to dry. I don't want that darkest color blending, running up in there. There's also just between the knuckles, and actually this one I am going to carry forward, since I have a pretty nice color right here at the moment for the shadow around the knuckles. And I'm going to go ahead and put that in on each finger right away while I have the perfect color on my brush. And it's a little bit thicker paint on purpose. I wanted to have a little thicker paint so that it will not run into wet areas. Now, obviously, when I'm working up here, it doesn't matter so much, right? Because there's nothing wet around it yet. But there will be something wet around it soon, so I want to use that slightly thicker paint. And this just happened to be some paint that I had mixed yesterday when I was doing the first part of the video, and I still had some of it on my palette, and I figured, well, I know that's nice and dry. It doesn't have too much going on in it. So I'm going to go ahead and put it on now. All right, now there's a little bit of the darker shadow right above the fingernail. So that's why that color is coming up here. Now there is going to be another darker color laid on top of it for the shadow from the handle. And so now you can see this is more typically what I do, is kind of once I get a color that's kind of the right value, I kind of go and I put it on all the fingers in the areas where I see that value. Now I did this here earlier, but since I'm getting close to the end of where I need this, the same value pretty much comes out front, but it's a wetter application. And the reason I know it's a wetter application is because it's got to run into and kind of blend out with other things that are going on. Need a little bit more, just extend it a bit further. So we're on, let's see, just make sure I'm looking at the right finger. So I'm on, there's the thumb, the second, actually this shape is this one. Yeah, so this goes here. This one here, but it's also going to be blending out, so I bring a little water in, I run it up to another part where it needs that darker color, and I put that darker color right here. Now again, there's going to be much darker there, but I'm kind of filling in the areas that will be much darker kind of at the same time. It helps me to remember what's the part that's nearly white. So around this finger, okay, so this comes up kind of like that. So I'm purely looking at shapes, and the only reason I'm talking fingers is I'm counting fingers and trying to make sure that I am on the one that I'm painting the one that I am I'm looking at here in the photo. And this is one time where I don't take a lot of liberties, because if you don't get the fingers right, then everything looks wrong. Okay, now there is, so I'm bringing a little bit more of the raw sienna in here because there's a little bit of a yellowish in this area. So I'm not only looking at value, but I'm also looking at, is it a pinker color or is it a yellowier color? And I have found that if I really just am using two colors, you may not get quite as many steps in between as what you're seeing in the photograph, but you're going to have enough variation in those colors. I'm trying to lift a little bit of white back out, so I'm going to have this favorite little flat brush that seems to do an excellent job at lifting, so I'm just going to use a little of that. And here's my paper towel. And I'm just grabbing a little piece of the paper towel because I don't want to touch those other areas that are wet. I just want to dab and press in the area I was trying to lift, so that's good. All right. I still go back to my round. When I'm painting faces, I tend to use rounds because I don't really want I don't really want flat square shapes. I want more rounded shapes. That's the kind of shapes we're trying to achieve. All right, now a little bit of the shirt just bled into the tip of her finger, so I'm actually gonna come back with this brush to see if I can't get the rounded shape of her finger back in without her fingernail suddenly having one fingernail that's painted the color of her clothes. There we go, that shape is better. Again, I'll just dab that one spot. Okay, I got it back mostly to the white, but with just a little tint on it, which is what I wanted. All right, now I need a little bit more of the rosy-ish colors. So again, a little bit of a blend of those two colors, because the Queen Coral's a little bit off on what you want for flesh tone. So I am blending it to get a little bit closer to a flesh tone color. Let's see. So I don't have to paint each finger separately if the same color is sort of running from one finger to the next. You get that separation when you add some shadowing in. And I'm not worried about the shadows just yet. Not the darker shadows anyway. I'm getting shadows in the sense that I've got lighter and darker areas, but I'm not putting in the darkest colors for the dark. So the darkest colors between the fingers in order to give that shape, those I'm not doing yet. And I think when I put this knuckle in, I was a little bit off on its position. That was supposed to be on the, more like that. So it's, you know, there's sort of a ridge. There's a ridge where the bone is on your knuckle, and that is light. But the other around it, because of shadows, can get dark. And so I needed a shadow that was not right on the knuckle, but on the other side of the knuckle. And on this finger, because of the position holding the mug, the bone is actually right next to the next finger over, and then the shadow is a little bit closer to the center of that knuckle because of the fact that it's a little bit shifted. You don't necessarily need to know the anatomy, but I do find I frequently will look at my own hands and try to put my hands in the shape of what I'm painting so I can really look at it and see anatomically what's going on and why does it look like, you know, here the bone is kind of where I expect the bone to be. It's kind of in the center of the finger, but over here, because of the twisting of the hand, the bone is a little bit over to what looks like to one side. Okay, I'm just going to bring a little bit brighter rosiness now in. So I'm just kind of gradually layering in going from the more tanny colors into the little bit rosier colors, and I'll bring the more purpley, darker colors in last, after it's had a chance to dry. And I am bringing them in at the moment a little bit on the dry side. In other words, not a lot of water. I mean, it's maybe milky kind of consistency to my paint, not tea, so that it will stay where I put it, and then I come in with a damp brush and just pull a little bit of softness on that edge, which you've seen me do many times before. Okay, so this finger still needs to be brightened up just a smidgen more. It's a little bit wider than the, oops, let's see, that's this finger, that's correct. Okay, and then this finger, I don't want just the straight pink, so again, I gotta bring a little bit of the raw sienna back over here, because I kind of used up most of that. But mixing in a little more coral than I was in the earlier blends. And so this finger, there's shadow in the front half, towards front being towards the finger tips of the fingers, and then a little bit rosier right there, than that first color I put down. All right, and then using the damp brush to kind of push that back into a softer edge, and kind of where I really want that color. I'm going to bring just a super pale yellow. You know, because the fingers twist a little bit, I'm constantly recounting and making sure I'm in the right spot. That's why I'm kind of keeping my finger on the painting, so that I can really watch where am I. There's a little bit more rosiness in this spot, but I'm going to put some yellow there first. Okay, I got the yellow on the other finger. So I think I did pretty good on getting the first pass on here, with the exception of, let's see, this is this finger. This needs to have a little tiny bit of rosiness kind of in the center, along the back side and in the center, and a little bit. keep going back and forth in this spot. It was running too far up her finger, away from her fingernail, and I lifted some out, and then I didn't have quite enough there, so that is pretty close on the flesh tone colors without the shadow. I'm gonna move on to the part of the foreshortened hand and arm that we're seeing here. And foreshortening is, you know, when you're looking down on something. This full length looks very short when looked on from this kind of an angle. And so you got to be careful, because in this case I actually didn't draw the line in that one spot where her hand is, and fortunately I had put the bracelet in, and so the hand actually is coming straight down here, and it is very tan. So this is a blend that's more of the raw sienna and a little less of the Quin Coral. And I see now that I've put the hand in here that I probably made this shadow area a little too low. When I did the bracelet, I could see that there was a little bit of a greenish color that was kind of on part of the darks on the bracelet, and it was also in some of these shadows, and I brought it up right away, and it actually was a little bit lower than it should have been. So I'm taking that back off as much as I can, and then when I come to do the rest of the shadows, I will take care of that shadow as well. So, you know, so I'm putting flesh tone in this picture. You can see there's lots of really dark shadow here, and it's got a little bit on the purple side, but first I want to get the flesh tone under it. And so again, I want to take a look at, here's the handle. There's a little gap actually between her arm and the handle, so I want the flesh tone here, and then the arm, you know, the arm gets wider as you're going down, right? So it's narrow at the hand, and then it gets wider, and we're looking down on that structure. And so we got to have the wide part that we can see from below that goes to her elbow. And initially I'm just going to bring that in mostly with the same color. There's a little bit yellow. That I'm going to need to add, but I'm going to bring it in initially just pretty much with the same color, and then I'm going to grab some of the yellow. In this case, I'm going to just let that blending happen on the paper. So that spot's very yellow because it's getting a little bit more light, and then I'm going to just bring little bits of that over, kind of a little bit randomly. The elbow itself looks extremely pink, but there's other little spots that are just got a little tiny bit of lightness to them and need to have a little bit of that yellow mixed in. All right, and when that's dry, I can then, well, not when it's 100% dry, but drier than it is right now, then I can start to bring in some of the colors that I think will work. And actually I'm going to do a little testing here in my palette. So yeah, I think if I use the ultramarine violet, so let me just show you that color in a cleaner spot. And I mix that with the quinacridone coral. I think that's going to be kind of what I need, and it is a little bit of a granulating, very minor granulating color, and I think I'm also going to need a little bit of the ultramarine blue. So I'm just kind of testing here on my palette rather than testing on the paper. think between those two colors I can get some really nice shadow going in there, and then when I get closer to the mug handle where it goes nearly black in the photograph, I think I'm going to need to bring a little of the burnt orange in with the ultramarine so that it's a little bit, it's not quite so black, but it's a little bit of a, you know, a grayish tone. And maybe with a little bit of this purple in there too. I think that's going to be pretty close to what I need in the darkest areas. All right, so this is probably at the point where I can start to do some of that. So let me start first with this outer edge. And actually I'm going to start up on the hand and fix the shadow that was up here. And that shadow actually runs right over the bracelet. You almost don't see the bracelet anymore. And I'm actually painting it, I do have little lines on here as to where this shadow should be going out to. And I'm painting a little shy of there because I know it's going to run some. That's pretty good for the lightest colors. It's looking just about right. All right, now I'm going to bring a little of the ultramarine in. And I'm going to start it over at that end. Okay, so I want to mix that with the burnt orange so that it's nearly a black. Usually you've seen me kind of do the mixing over here because you can go from black to brown. And I want this a little bit more towards the black end, right up near the handle. In fact, part of this that I just painted is the handle, so let me put truly black there. A little bit of black in this upper part, right under her fingers. And now I want a much thinner, grayer version of that. Coming out part way. And then that's getting almost a little bit too far away from skin color. So, I'm gonna mix a little of, gonna just do a little blendings on here first. So I brought a little Quinn Coral in. Probably need a little bit of the yellow too. Raw sienna. Okay, let's see how this color works. Now that's really wet, so again, I'm putting it further in, you know, kind of in and among, I need a little more blue, in and among the darkest color. I do want to have some of the bluey tones there. And then, I'm letting it run on purpose so that it will do some really nice blending. Bring a little bit more of that. So now I'm brushing into the color, other colors, with the ultramarine violet. I'm just picking up a small amount, and I'm actually testing it on my palette because I just want a small amount of it. I don't want too much. All right, and now I'm going to lift a little bit of that bracelet back out. Now it's looking a little funny because we don't have the rest of the handle there on that mug, so I'm gonna finish defining that handle. I want to bring a little bit more of the burnt orange, quinacridone burnt orange into that so that it goes to the browns. So there's variation, it's not all just total black. And since there's a lot of black there, I just have to pick up the burnt orange in order to, and let it blend with the black that's already there. And I am pushing the color a little bit browner than I see in the photo, but I'm doing that quite on purpose, just to help define where that edge is. And then I'll let it go back to black. There's another one of those. I think we're seeing some of the inlay layering, and there's a little white edge, but I want to go black just before I get to that whiter edge. And then her shirt has a lot of shadow on it, and it seems to start essentially from a black to gray. So I'm just kind of pulling some gray out from that black area, and then wet my brush and pull it a little bit further. But it's there's no more paint in my brush, so I'm just kind of blending it with some of the other colors that had been there, which was mostly a Twin Coral and Cobalt Blue burnt blend. That's a really lovely lavender. And then I grabbed a little bit of this other mixtures that are sitting there in order to kind of round that out. All right, so now we've reached the point where this new paint is starting to encroach a little too far and beyond where the shadows are. Pull it back a little bit, which is why we have the pink on there first. We don't want to be exposing white paper. Now we may have to come back over with skin tone one more time because sometimes you get a little lifting that you don't want. I'm also going to put a little bit of water in this area to have some variations in how dark that shadow is. And, you know, I am looking at the photo a little bit and taking some cues from there, but I'm also just kind of, what does the painting need? And I think that blending where it's a little more random, there's a little more of the skin showing through, is maybe a little bit better. It's a little different than in the photo, but I think it's a little bit better for a painting. It feels somehow better. It feels more right. It doesn't look like, you know, why there's this funny color transition there. Okay, so I just brought a little more Quin Coral in here on this part of her hand because I wanted to come back in with a damp brush and kind of move some of that into some of the shadow area and kind of fix up this shape over here beyond the knuckles. Now there's still this tiny shadow that the knuckles are casting, and I'm thinking I can just pick up some of these grays that we just used, and I'm just kind of dabbing them around the knuckle area. And there is a little shadow that comes up onto her hand, and that's in there right now, but it almost looks a little weird. So I'm gonna go with what the photo says, because there's a little more shadow coming around the side of her finger, and I think now that I've added that other shadow makes a little more sense. And now this kind of grayish purpley blend that we've been using in the under the arm will work pretty well, I think, for the little tiny bit of shadow that's between the fingers. And honestly, this is a shadow that you got to be really careful on how you put it in, because you don't want it to look like a hard line. And this is where the shadow is kind of wrapping up onto the finger a little bit. So I kind of put it in where I think I see it, and then, like you often see me do, come back with a damp brush and just soften it so it's not a hard edge that we're seeing for that shadow. You know, we're putting shadow on a human. In the human form, the shadows tend not to be harsh shadows. All right, now that ended up looking a little bit more brown. So I'm putting a tiniest bit of some of this, what I think is the ultramarine, primarily the ultramarine violet, but maybe with a little bit of the ultramarine blue mixed in. Okay, now the next finger, well actually I'm going to put the shadow here on the index finger first. So again, I'm using that same blend, just some of the leftovers. And when you go to do the little line between the fingers, you almost want to just do little dashes here and there. You don't really want to fill the whole thing in, because then that doesn't look right. And I do see a little tiny bit of rosiness in the upper extent of, so I'm grabbing a little bit of this blend that I had made when I was working on the dress, and just dotting a little bit of that in that crevice. And I think I'll do the same thing here on the furthest out piece of the shadow. I think it's better to go slightly warmer. And this knuckle is still not quite developed right. It's got a little bit of a wiggle shape. And then it kind of dissipates into the rest of the finger. Why is this? Okay, so this is part of what I put down before okay, so these were the little dots I put in of the other color. Now I need to get the grayish, bluish, slightly violet color coming in here, so that we know this is the shadow between those other fingers. And I actually, may have just noticed that I kind of was putting little dashes of that into that same crevice area. Now in the photo, that is one of the darker shadows, and I need to decide just how dark am I willing to go. I think I'm going to grab a little bit more of the violet, not mixed. And you know, you got to be willing to experiment a little bit with your painting. And if it, you know, if it doesn't look like it's working, then you know, can lift it off. And in this case, I know that the ultramarine violet does lift. This is another reason to really get to know your paints. Okay, this goes forward actually all the way up here. I actually like that violet color more than the grays. It's kind of picking up some of the colors from her clothing and some of the colors of some of the wood in the mug. I'm actually putting a little bit of that violet color on one of the pieces of woods, because there are some of these woods, they're kind of maroony, but they also have a little bit of a purpley look to them. And I kind of put a purple stripe at the edges of some of those, but then I hadn't come back yet and added some a little bit purpley stripes into them that I can also see Let's see, that's gonna be one of those right there. So let me put a little of the purple down first on this one. Sometimes it's good to experiment to see which is the best order to do your colors in. So, well, I've got two different purples out. I've got the ultramarine violet and, I shouldn't say two purples. I have the ultramarine violet and I have a carbazole purple. And some of these darker shapes, I'm actually taking all three of those in order to make the darkest stripe. So it's not a black, it's just a very dark blend of colors because I'm using all dark values together. And then I'm coming back, just so you can see how I did some of this. I'm coming back with the quinacridone burnt orange, which is not the color of the wood, but you do that next. And in this case, I'm putting it over a little, very thin layer of that ultramarine violet. And then to get it a little bit rosier, I'm grabbing a little bit of the quin coral. So, you really want to be mixing the same colors that are in other parts of the painting. So we've used a lot of quin coral in her skin. It makes sense if you need a little bit rosier thing to add the quin coral to that object, because then it's all in the same color palette. And then there are a lot of purple tints to this particular wood. So I'm also putting a little bit of the carbazole violet. And that's actually pretty darn close to the color of that wood. Now, these little pieces fit together like a jigsaw. And I do like to kind of draw some lines, even though I don't really see lines in the pattern. But I think it helps the viewer. That one should be darker than it is, so I'm just going to go ahead and darken it. Separates it also a little bit better from her chest. It was too close in color to the chest. And just so happens it's closer now in color to what it really is, the wood it really is. Sometimes you make adjustments for the sake of the painting, and other times, they're serendipitous with what you kind of needed anyhow. Now where we're seeing in some spots here, we can see the top of the mug. So you have a little line coming out in one direction, and then it goes down the length of the piece. But it's because we're seeing where that slice is coming through the top. And it's important to get those shapes right. Okay. I'll fill in the other things later. I want to kind of get back to her fingers here. I'm still, I'm partially happy with what's going on here, and I'm partially not happy. So I want to look at it a little bit longer to kind of figure out if should I be making some other adjustments. I have it a lot more of that ultramarine violet color right now, and I'm actually coming back and adding a little bit of browniness back into it that I had earlier said I didn't want, but I think it looks a little more convincing. And then the last thing I do is there are little knuckle shapes, and sometimes you just need to pop up a little bit more redness to really get those knuckle shadows to kind of stand out. Now this one I can see that there's a little bit darker value underneath, and I'm have been trying to avoid doing that for fear it would be a little too much, but I think the paint had dried sufficiently, but I didn't have to worry about it blending anymore, and I do think adding that in a little bit stronger was the right thing. Now in that case it was that kind of shape. Over here I really see more of a reddish tone, so I'm grabbing a little bit of alizarin crimson and just dabbing a little bit of that in there. And then there's a little rosiness on the edge of the thumb. When I painted the thumb the first time, it was a little bit too wet, and so there's some rosiness that kind of needs to be brought back in, and I probably should be using the coral to be more consistent rather than the alizarin crimson. On this area where I needed the dark shadow, the alizarin crimson was the right answer, but on the thumb, I really need to get back to the coral. And then there's some areas that, because it was too wet when I did it, some of the brown from the mug handle actually ran into the finger. So let me get my trusty little lifter out here and just pull a little bit of that light that's on the top of her thumb back out. Just have that one spot. Okay. And correct this shape. All right. And then I need to pull this shadow down there slightly and across here. Okay. That's more convincing. And then there's what I didn't do earlier. There are some very subtle skin variations, very tiniest amount of pinkish color in some portions of the finger, and I needed most of it to be dry before I could bring those in, so that we don't have some of those harsh transitions. You know, we sort of had the lightest light and we had the medium and dark colors, but we didn't have those in between tones that were still needed. I also think that these shadows are close to the color in the photo, but they're looking a little non-skinny. So when those are dry, I think I'm going to put one more little coat of coral over the top of them to just make them feel a little bit more like skin. So, you know, there are those final little, you know, let's get a little more consistency. I feel like, you know, I've been painting all of these interesting little shapes in order to get the fingers looking like fingers, but now we need some of those smoother transitions happening. Go ahead and just put the coral over that one right now. And actually this one I did fairly early as well, so since I need a little coral on it, just on the inside of that anyhow. Over the shadows too, and I think that's making a lot of difference. And then there's also a little bit of a coral color right here, which separates between the third finger, the ring finger, and the light area in the middle finger. And I have a hard edge right here that I need to remove because it's making that part of the middle finger look like it's part of the next finger, and it's really not. So, you know, you sort of paint initially based on what do I see. Don't think about the fact I'm painting fingers. And then you come back and you now start looking at them as fingers and say, okay, now where does the junction between the fingers look funky? And how do I, you know, how do I bring them together as a single finger? You know, and painting back over these shadow areas with the flesh tone so that it kind of integrates the shadow in with the rest of the finger. Now the fingernails, I'm putting hardly any color on them because they do seem to be standing out fairly brightly. But I do think, you know, you gotta then evaluate, is it too bright for the photo? Do I need to do a little something slightly different? And so I am ending up bringing a little bit more of the pinky color there. All right, now I spent a lot of time trying to open up and keep these whites, upper part of the skin white. Now I just brought in some shadow that's more of a pinky shadow next to the dark shadow. And when I did that, I lost some of the white. So it's sort of a back and forth thing here. It might be too wet for me to try to do this. But I'm trying to put little bits of the pink right on top of that darker line as well to blend it in more and make it feel more unified. All right, and now that I've done that and brought these lighter colors in, I think there's these light pinks, I think I need to remove, come back in one more time and do a little bit of lifting here and there. To get some of the lightest parts standing out. So this just filled in a little bit. There we go. Just filled in a little bit more than I need. So, you know, watercolor painting is a lot of adding and removing, because it does run, and I think I see now what I need to do to separate those two fingers is I need to bring a little bit of yellow in here, because this is part of that finger. I want it not to look like it's part of this the index finger and not part of the middle finger. I need to separate those a little bit. Oh, and there's a little lighter spot right here. So here's another one of those, you know, so earlier when I was working on her face, I mentioned, well, if you put some granulating, I think I was using cobalt blue on an area where you're trying to lift a staining color, that you can do some lifting. And that's kind of what I just did. I want the yellow color there, and I put the raw sienna in that spot where I wanted it, and then when I did that, I realized that I really needed to lift a little of the light color up further than it was going. And because that was the raw sienna, it made it a little bit easier to get some of that pink staining color back off. Part of what I'm fighting with here on this knuckle, and I think I just accomplished what I needed, was there was a little pencil line that was making it confusing of which finger was which. And I've successfully been able to get that off, so now I think they'll read better. I just want just a little bit of the tan color, the Rossiana. Don't know why I keep stammering over Rossiana. In a couple other areas, and then I'm going to actually take advantage of the being able to lift a little bit lighter out further in a couple spots where they shrunk. You know, it was important to get that Quin Coral over the whole finger in order to integrate it and make it look like a full finger, but now I need to get a couple of those lights pulled back out again. See one little spot where the finger is coming up to the handle. That is slightly misshapen. There's a shadow from the thumb. It needs to be here so that the index finger doesn't look like it's got a bend in it. Pick up a little bit more of that violet color, and I'm going to try to use this little tiny flat. There we go. That's what I've been trying to accomplish. There was this little tiny shadow right there that I thought was pretty important. That's helping a lot. Now, the knuckle shapes themselves. So here's sort of one of those final finesse things you have to do. Your knuckles, and we're looking kind of down on the knuckles, and so there are little indent areas between them, and so you got to think about, okay, I've been painting these knuckles, I've got them joining right up to each other, but in reality there should be a little tiny open space right between those knuckles. So this, this is again one of those little final finesse of what do I need to do to make them look correct. I mean, if you're trying to have an anatomically correct, fairly realistic painting, which is what I'm trying to do here, if not photorealistic, but realistic nonetheless, representational. Those little tiny details do matter. And what I'm doing now is, I've carved out those little knuckle shapes, and now what I'm trying to do is bring a little tiny blending transition with the finger. So now I'm not on the knuckle, I'm now on the little finger in between that we're just seeing the tiniest bit of, and make sure that those are visible transitions. Let's see, I just have this one left. Yeah, And in this case, I kind of deviated from what I'm seeing in the photo. Probably just repositioned her finger just the slightest amount. To make it look correct to me. And then the last thing that's been bothering me is this little finger here. This fingernail is poking out a little too far. The dress needs to actually come back, come over that in order to get that shape right. And right there too. So, you know, I'm probably spending just about as long on this hand as I did on the face. Because hands, you know, they have a lot going on, and if you don't spend the time on those, people are gonna say, oh, there's something wrong with that hand. People are pretty unforgiving on that stuff. So if you have a hand in your photo, you know, give it the time it requires. So that it looks just as convincing as the face. All right, so speaking of the face, I still need to come up and do the eyeliner above her eye. And although I mixed it with that brush, I really want to use my lizard lick. Because I really just need a very thin line. It does mean I need to remix, because now that I wet the lizard lick so the paint will flow, I need to have a little more paint in the brush. All right, so I'm trying to watch this one, and I need to cut it similarly. So I might need just a tiny bit more brown brought in. But now those shapes are a lot closer. Maybe I'll add a couple more little eyelashes right there. And bring this down a tiny bit lower on the eye. Now there's two things that's going on. You actually get shadows on your iris from your eyelashes, and so the very top of the eye really should be a little darker. And I'm just going to layer a little bit of the black in there, which I thought I had done on both eyes, but now I'm not so sure that I had done it on her right eye, because I think that was partly why it came out too tall. Because I had her eyelashes too tall, and then I didn't bring the shadow down. And so I think when I step back and look at it now, I'm going to be a lot happier with that. And the one other thing that I wanted to kind of look at a little bit more is I brought the shadow in under her eye. I've kind of lost some of the rosiness. And I wanted to bring some of that back in on her upper eyelid. Not so much that I lose that shadow, but enough to make that look right. And then the shadow that runs along the edge of the nose, I don't want it to be a hard line, but you got to bring it in and then soften the inner part on the cheek edge so that it transitions in without being too hard. portion. It looks like I need to maybe soften just a smidgen also on the inside, on the top of the nose part. There is a tiny bit of a pink rosiness that does go right over that part of the bridge. I don't want it to look like she's raccoon with glasses. It does dissipate out pretty quickly. But that's part of how you get the fact that, you know, this is a recessed portion of your nose, and there is a little shadow there, flesh-colored shadow, but there is a little shadow. When you first put the paint down, it always spreads out a little further than you wanted it, but then you can pull it over to where you need it. I did have little tiny lines that showed me just how high it was supposed to come, and I wasn't reaching those lines. Now, the other thing that I still wanted to add, and I wanted you to see me add this, was there's often a little, I guess the center of our skull actually indents a little bit. You know, it rises. It's lower here and then comes back up around above the eyes, and so there is often just a super pale color of shadow in the center of the forehead. I do spend a lot of time touching my face when I'm doing portraits to kind of remind myself, why am I seeing what I'm seeing? So it's very much a, it's for me a very analytical thing when I'm doing faces, when I'm looking for reality. Sometimes I'm just kind of doing a fun take on someone, and I'm just trying to represent kind of their emotional, my emotional response to them. And in those paintings, I don't get quite as hung up on making sure the shadows are exactly right. But, and for that matter, the colors are not, I'm not trying to get realistic colors either, so. From a realistic portrait, these are things that I definitely think about. All right, I'm gonna do one more little pass over her arm, and I'm gonna clean this up first. Palettes. Got too much of the ultramarine violet and blue out here. Don't want that on the face at all, obviously. That would be pleasant. All right, so that water's getting pretty dirty, so that's why I jumped over here. A little bit more violet to get rid of. All right, so back to the arm. So let me bring the photo up. You can see, actually there's one more little shadow that I see I didn't do. So there's one more shadow that kind of comes down in the center. Does begin a little bit up here at the hand. Again, I wet my brush in case you didn't notice that. And I'm just kind of pulling that color down into this shape. All right, so now I'm actually gotta let that dry. And then when that's dry, I can come and do one more wash over this lower part of the arm and kind of integrate the shadow in with everything else. As much as I said I needed to be very careful to make sure this upper hand part was shaped right, I see that I actually can't come out as far as the bracelet does because the bracelet is on top of the arm, right, and going around the edge of the hand. So it was poking out just the smallest amount too far. Now I need to bring the edge of the bracelet back up there, and I was using a little bit of raw sienna, but I was also using a little bit of Quin Gold to give it a little bit of an extra shininess. So I'm going to go hit that one more time so that it's going around the wrist and not the wrist going around it. So two things that need to dry. So while we're waiting for those things to dry, let me come in and finish up some more of the wood. So this is another one of those purpley woods. In fact, I think all of these holes were the same wood. Yeah. So just bring a little bit of the purple in first. I'm saying purple, it's really violet. It's the ultramarine violet. For the darkest edge, I want to mix the violet, the ultramarine violet, with the carbazole purple and a little bit of French ultramarine. And then each of them has a little bit of a darker stripe, this being the darker stripe here, and that piece there actually going to be the lighter section. Should have brought some of the ultramarine violet over that. So let me do that. I had forgotten I had put a little bit of the Quin burnt orange over there already last night. Now, several of these pieces of wood are actually, they've got not truly a triangle shape, but they're kind of a trapezoid shape where they bend around the edge. So you can see that this mug, it sort of has a bend point there, right? So there's a plane here, there's a plane here, there's a plane there. And so these corner pieces actually literally go around the corner, so they're cut into a shape that complies with where that corner is. And in the corners, you end up having a little bit of a shadowy area. And so I like to use that ultramarine violet there as well. Now here's one that I started last night. It's going around the corner. I brought some of the darks in, but I hadn't brought the browns in yet. And then when it went around the corner, it's getting more light from the upper right corner, and so this side looks like it's a different wood, but it's really the same wood. It's just getting more lit on that other plane. All right, so let me this is kind of when I bring in a little bit of the, oh, that was too wet, but let's see, let's look at, grab a little bit of the darker brown over here, and this one here, and it's a little bit of a wood grainy effect in here, so I'm just doing a few little dibs and dabs to imply some of the grain of the wood. And this lighter piece, you can see a little of that in there too. So in this case, you know, I'm not really looking at how is the grain of the wood in that exact piece of wood. I'm just saying, okay, I need grain here, and I'm just kind of randomly putting in little lines. And then here's a little segment over here that's got some grain, but they look a little orangier, so. I want the orangey blend. I'm not sure I'm getting the orangey blend. All right, now let's back to these guys. So next step is, at least the way I've been painting these, is I bring the Quin burnt orange over the violet. Bring a little of the Quin coral into that to get it redder. And because it's very wet, I can just kind of dab that color. I don't have to paint it like a... And then I think in this case, I really want it dark. It's kind of in the shadowy side, so I'm going to bring a little bit of the alizarin in there too. And then we'll come back with more purple tones. Some of these look almost black. So I grab some of these really dark blends. And I'm going to add a little bit of purple in here too. When I need darks, I will often grab a little purple because it really helps with that value shift. And because I've got so many other colors in there already, it's gonna all blend and just look kind of dark. And then I'm gonna add a little bit more of this ultramarine violet to push it back into the slightly more violet color wood. Alright, so we got this one. And there's one more piece of wood right here at the edge that looks like it's missing. don't want the edge pieces on the mug to be lost, because then the mug starts looking really misshapen. And it just so happens that there were a bunch of really dark pieces over there, so the dark pieces were getting lost with the gap between the handle and seeing the purple dress behind it, so I reinforced those as a result. And I also don't want this one to get lost with the dress, so I'm going to bring that one a little darker than it really is to separate those just a little bit. That's the one that I tried several times to get that wood grain in there, and I kept having too much of a wrong paint on my brush, so I'm going to lift all of that back off and get this later. And I can always add some wood grain in later. And some of the yellow blondie wood ones, oh no, actually that is about the right color for that one, but I think I'm going to pop it up a little bit more gold. Some of them, I think what's happened is the color next door bled in a little bit, and I lost some of the golden hues, so I got to lift some of that back, surface stuff back off. Get back to the golden paint that was put down there in the first place. And even on this base piece on the mug. So, you know, you can see that even though I often paint pretty loosely on you know, when I go to do portraits, I want the portraits to be pretty close to reality. Okay, so this arm is nicely dried now, so I had mixed this Quin Coral and Rossiana earlier, and I want to bring this back over the arm. Okay, so this is, you know, my normal thing. You bring some down and then you wet your brush without paint and you pull it out into other areas so that you're keeping your value shifts. And then I need to grab a little more paint because now I've lost what was there that could spread. And I'll put a little bit more of this coral over that shadow to reinforce this is skin, not something else over here. And make sure that that shadow is distinct now. I was being a little loose with my brush, so now I got some of the skin color onto the shirt. I want the shirt to stand out as white. So I've got to get that back off of there and then dry it so it won't keep running in. But the trick is there was a tiny bit of pink tone there anyway because it was down on this area though. And not at the upper edge, and then I don't want it on the upper edge because then it gets lost between where is the skin and where is the shirt. and these other little pink stains, I think that what we're seeing is the impact of the dress through the gauzy material. So we're seeing through it a little bit. Okay, now take a little bit of cobalt blue with just the tiniest touch of the quin coral to get kind of a lavender, and I want to bring that into the shadow area coming up here, and there's this little gap of white that needs to be that lighter shadow area. And it needs to be like that on the other side too. There we go. This is when you're really in danger, because I'm working two wet areas right next to each other and asking for the colors to bleed into each other, which is not, of course, the intent. Okay, now we want a little more blue than black. There is a very dark blue shadow that's emerging at the very top. Okay, that's as far as I dare go, because it'll be hitting wet stuff and blending where I don't want it. Okay, that's good. And now we have one more little square here that I need to finish up. This time I'm going to actually do it in a little bit different order, just to see. Put the alizarin down first, get more of the reddish tint. This is an interesting wood. I'd like to know what the wood is, because it's got a lot of a purple tones in it and some red tones, and some brown tones, so it's kind of an interesting thing. All right, so I brought the alizarin over the ultramarine violet, and now I'm going to put just a touch of the quin for an orange. I don't want too much of that. I think that's pushing it a little bit in the wrong direction, so just a tiny bit of that. And then I need this darker application over here in this corner of that ultramarine violet. So that's a very creamy blend that I put there. And this needs to have that too. It had it and then it kind of dissipated. Now I do want it to blend out a little bit, but I don't want it to dissipate as much as it did. And the same on this side. And actually there's a little bit more of that really dark bluish violet color over here. Okay. And I think when that's dry, I'm going to need one more touch of the alizarin on top to get that to the right color. Try that on this one. Yeah, so some of these pieces of wood are not coming out exactly the colors that they are. And we actually own one of these mugs, so I know what it is that I'm looking at in the photo and what I'm trying to achieve, and I knew I was going to need to layer some of these colors to get it right, but I don't really have it right yet. Adding just a bit more of the alizarin on there. I wish I knew. I would love to see a piece of that wood before assembled into a mug. Okay, so what I'm doing right now is there's these little tiny white gaps. And because the alizarin is a dark color, I'm just kind of filling them in with those, with the alizarin that's on my brush. Although I'm running out, so back with another color there. Oops, there's still a gap. This appears to be in more of the golden one, so let me hit it with a little green gold. In my attempt to stay within the lines of the squares, I was leaving tiny gaps, which is not good. And then the other thing that I do kind of at this point on when you have another, you know, a finicky thing like this, I'm thinking a little of the mug ran into her chest here. Although I also did some, I did have one spot of her skin that was missing that I brought in, and doesn't look like I had blended it out well, so doing that now. And there's a couple little spots of her hair is coming across her chest that still had little white lines from the masking fluid. Now that's her earring, but I want to hit those too. And because they don't feel like spots where, you know, you would be getting a little extra light reflection and it would be going all the way to white. So I need to cover all the little white spots that don't feel like they belong. And that's one thing that, you know, when you do work with masking fluid, you do need to make sure when you come back and add paint that you don't miss any of it unless there's supposed to be white highlights. You know, and I'm not trying to make them a dark color, I just want to get a little bit of color on them. All right, so, of course, I've got a little funny triangle right there on her arm. Not sure why that is there. Fill that in. Okay. And I'm just going to come back with a damp brush and do one more pass over her hand with the damp brush, just so the paint can, if there's a few hard edges, it'll just loosen up a little bit and move around just a smidge. Because you paint a lot of little, you know, paint a little piece here, paint a little piece there, and in the long run, you need it to look like just shadows and transitions in the skin, and you don't want them to be too hard-edged. But, you know, just you have to use a very light touch when you're doing it. You'll notice that I tend to do that when I paint, that I use the lighter touch the less manipulation of the paper and the less likely it is that you'll have any issues with muddy looks in your painting, where the paint, you know, but really there's a couple of things that happen there. The paint gets the paper itself gets a little scuffed up, and then it doesn't take the paint quite the same. That actually should be, some of these purple lines should really be part of the dress and not part of this, not part of the shirt. So I was starting to try to loosen them up and turn them into shirt, but I really think they were parts of the dress. And of course now I have it blending in here because I wet this. There is a little bit of a lavender color here, which I need to bring back in, but don't want to go all the way to that. Now, there probably are a few of these. This area probably should have been out further. I don't know if I can remove this paint and get that shape back. Probably asking a lot. Let me go back to my little lifter. Where'd you go? There you are. It's important I don't go into that dirty water when I'm doing this. And let me try using a little bit of the cobalt blue in there. And then lifting this purple may be so staining that I'm going to have a hard time getting that out, but if we can get it light enough and just kind of pull some of that color up into the shirt, we can make it convincing that that was supposed to be that way. I do think that little puffiness there on that part of the shirt is important to have. And actually there is a little bit of a violet color coming up into that region. I'm going to add a little cobalt blue that I want, just to blue it up a smidgen more. And then fade it into the rest of the cobalt blue that is in the shirt already. I had done some of the little crease patterns. There's a little elastic part here in the shirt where there's little, it's pulling the shirt in this region, and then it puffs back out again. And there's a little bit more of these kind of crease lines coming out that I hadn't done yet. Just a few little extra detail things that really make a portrait work. And I'm also going to bring, there's a little bit of a cobalt blue shadow over here that I'm actually going to overlap a little bit with the background. to be nice and soft and gentle. So it's another one of those, you put some on you, then you take it back off. But I wanted it to be strong enough to, maybe I'll even go to a tiny bit of ultramarine. Let's see if we have to. Yeah, that might help. To bring that shirt out. In fact, I like that ultramarine. And add a little bit more of that into this shadow area. Base, there's one piece that I've known I needed to lift here. On the bottom of the handle, there's, much like there's a light one on the top of the handle, there's a little light edge to the wood down here that I need to carve out so that it stands out from the shadow on the arm, which is being thrown by this handle. And I'm also going to use a little of the ultramarine to kind of help define the edge of that handle. Just a little bit more. Separate it a bit more from the shadow. Okay. One more pass. Here, and the top of this thumb. I intentionally left the top of this thumb very light, and it is very light, but it feels right at the moment like it's not part of the skin and it's part of the handle, so I'm just going to pink it up a little bit. You know, one of those times where you have to deviate from what you're seeing in the photo to make something understandable. All right, well, I'm not signing her yet because I do think, you know, invariably I see a little something that I want to alter before all is said and done. Another little spot where, in this case, the background came in over the shirt. And there is also a little bit of a bluish shadow here, so we're using my little bit of cobalt, because that is the color I used in a lot of the shadows to begin with. Define where that edge shadow is, and then the lighter area once that that paint, you know, when you do some lifting, you're wetting also a little bit of the outer paint, and I feel like I can see my pencil marks a little bit more on this edge than I want. And I don't usually worry about removing pencil marks, but in this case, it's just, you know, most of them I don't see anymore in the painting, and so seeing them in one area is bothering me. And my pencils are probably all upstairs where I was doing some drawing earlier, so there's some other pencils that I'm going to go grab that are over where I do a lot of my drawing. So I'm not going to go where I was just removing paint, but I'm going to come down here. Oh yeah, that's good. Sometimes I find it's hard to get rid of the pencil lines after you've painted. But in this case, it looks like they lifted pretty well. There's also a little pencil line here on her nose that's been bothering me. And probably what that means is that little tiny crease in your nose is probably not quite there yet. And this is another one of those, you put it on and then you need to blend it out a little bit so it doesn't look like a little line. It just looks like a shift in shadows. And the little lines where I also drew where the pink on the end of the nose belonged are also bothering me, so actually where's, I get a little bit of the sienna. It's looking a little better already, so now I don't see my pencil lines that I was seeing. You know, so I had been using the Quin Coral only in this upper area where we always have a little bit of a rosiness around the top of our noses. And I just added a little bit of Quin Coral to that, and it's looking much better. It's looking like it should now. So interesting how that just tiny, tiny, subtle shift was enough to make that now more readable. Okay, and the other thing that I put the little bit of a darker shadow above her eye, but that too is a little bit of a too harsh of a line. It just bled and I missed it earlier. No, it doesn't want to lighten up, so let's put a little bit more of the shadow over here. And this is the spot where I'm just putting in a touch of the cobalt teal. Which also happens to be one of her favorite colors. Will help bring some curvature around the eye. had put that in earlier, and when I came back and adjusted some of those shadows, I had lifted it out because the cobalt teal, like the cobalt blue, does lift easily. So it's just very, very pale, very subtle. And it doesn't look weird. You would think, really, you're putting cobalt blue on somebody's face, but there really are little shadows that just need that little tiny shift of color from flesh tones to make it work. Excellent. Put my eraser away here. Get my little there. I still feel like this part of the white of the eye was a tiny bit too bright, so put a little cobalt teal on there too. There's one little curl of hair. That I think is important. Why this one little curl of hair would be important, I don't know, but it is. I want it just, it's coming across and just barely making it over to her chest, and until I got that dark of the dress in there, we weren't seeing it. Here we go. I think we got it. There's one light spot. That was masking fluid that I'm trying to hide also. I came down a little lower. I want to really accentuate that little curl. There we go. There's your curl, Greta. She has such beautiful curls. I don't want to lose her curls. We did lose some on this side of her head, and because I had actually over masked, and so when I removed the mask, there was lots of just white of the paper, more white of the paper than I had intended. And so I feel like, you know, there's just a few places where I want to get some of these curls back in here. So just by wetting it and then dabbing it, I can get some of the little curls back. And I kind of needed to wait until some of the dress was painted because it was hard for me to see initially where's the hair and where's the textures in the dress. Because there are some, you know, there's this little brocade stuff that's in the dress, and I didn't want to confuse those parts, and so it was sort of took me painting one part of it first, and then I could come back and make some more adjustments. So since you didn't see all of the adjustments I've had to make in the hair, it seems like as good a time as any to do that. Although, I've worked right through lunch. All right, yeah, I guess I'm gonna go get some lunch after I add a few curls back. Oh, I'm not really using the right brush for this. This is better. And she has lots of reddish tones as well as golden and brown tones in her hair. So I'm just using a little thin coral here and there to add a few more curl shapes. And maybe I'll do a little bit more of that on the other side as well. Get a little bit more of the variety that really is in her hair. All right, that's probably enough. All right, I'm gonna, I'll stare at it for a day or two, probably do a few little tweaks here and there, but overall, I think you have seen pretty much the whole process on how I handle skin. All right, that was a tiny bit of coral and a tiny bit of raw sienna.